Subcommittees will come to order, and good afternoon. And welcome to today's joint hearing of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, and the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa, as we turn our attention to an overlooked aspect of the crisis in Syria, the religious minorities caught in the middle of the conflict and apparently targeted by government forces as well as rebel groups. More than 93,000 Syrians were killed in this horrendous and seemingly endless civil war. More than 4.25 million people are displaced within Syria, and millions more are fleeing to safety in the surrounding countries of Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and Iraq. It is disturbing to note that 1 in 5 of the refugees is Christian, although Christians in Syria make up 1 in 10 of the pre-war population of 22 million people. This would seem to indicate that Christians are even more fearful for their lives and safety than other segments of the Syrian population. Before the war, Syria was a fairly pluralistic society with Alawites, Shias, Ismailis, Yazidis, Druze, Christians, Jews, Sunnis, living in relative peace side by side. The situation was far from perfect, as President Bashar Assad's regime had a vast security apparatus in place, with members inside each of the religious communities to monitor their activities. The Assad government was guilty of serious human rights violations, including the summary imprisonment and execution of political prisoners. But relations between various religious groups was generally not violent. That civil coexistence has ended with the war. In February of this year, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic reported that, and I quote, "The conflict has become increasingly sectarian, with the conduct of the parties becoming significantly more radicalized and militarized." Commission report stating that, quote, "Entire communities are at risk of being forced out of the country or being killed inside the country, with communities minority with suspicion, accusing churches of laundering money and goods for opposition forces and forbidding banks from transactions for certain churches. There is also evidence that the Assad regime encouraged sectarian tensions in order to maintain power, perhaps believing that if people were afraid of Islamists commandeering a nominally secular state, the people would be more likely to support Assad over the opposition. In December of 2012, Time magazine reported allegations that the Assad regime was paying individuals to pose as opposition supporters and chant slogans at protests, including "the Christians to Beirut" and "the Alawites to the grave." Our own government has voiced concern about the particular threat posed to Christians in Syria. According to the State Department's International Religious Freedom Report for 2012, quote, "The regime continued to frame opposition actions as targeting the Christian population. At the same time, it increased its own targeting of Christian and Alawi anti-regime activists in order to eliminate minority voices that might counter its narrative of Sunni-sponsored violence." Religious minorities seem to fear the opposition forces. Some prominent opposition groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, have a religious basis which has been seen as threatening to Syria's Alawite and Christian minorities. Smaller opposition factions, such as the al-Qaeda-affiliated Jihadist al-Nusra Front, take explicitly sectarian positions. There are reports of incidents in which rebel forces engaged in sectarian violence, such as burning Shiite mosques. Christians are perceived by many in the opposition to be Assad loyalists, possibly due to Assad's aggressive recruitment of Christians into the regime militias at the start of the civil war. Other reports indicate that Christians attempted to remain neutral, either out of pacifism or concern about their rights under opposition forces. Christian neutrality was perceived by some opposition groups as loyalty to the regime. In December of 2012, a rebel force believed to be associated with the Muslim Brotherhood released a YouTube entitled "Warning Mainly Christian Cities in the Provinces of Hamal," and promising a tax if they continue to support the house pro-Assad forces. Christian leaders have been targeted, such as the April 2013 kidnappings of 2 Syriac Orthodox Church and bishops. Both men have still not been returned. The Jewish community reports being targeted as well. In March of 2013, a Jewish leader reported to Christian Solidarity International, who will testify today, our people get stopped at checkpoints and are asked which sect they belong to. Once the militias hear that they are Swahili, a province where 90% of the population is Druze, our men disappear. The Al-Nusra Front, a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization, has been blamed for much of the sectarian rhetoric and violence, but dozens of the opposition groups ascribe to an Islamic jihadist ideologies and mingle with the Free Syrian Army, which the U.S. may now be supporting. Over the last 3 years, the United States has committed to providing $250 million to various opposition groups in Syria, at least $117 million of which has already been funded, largely to the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces. With the chemical weapon red line crossed, the administration has also agreed to provide ammunition and small arms as well. It is not clear whether any of this new lethal assistance will go to the Free Syrian Army and its worrisome opposition groups. The administration also committed to send an additional $300 million in humanitarian aid to, quote, vulnerable groups in and around Syria. It is not clear whether distribution of this aid will be informed by the plight of religious minorities. I am very concerned that the administration may not be taking seriously enough the targeting of religious minorities, which is why we've called this hearing. Too often we have heard from the administration that they have bigger issues to deal with than the vulnerability of religious minorities. In the last 2 appropriation cycles, we have directed the administration to condition aid, for example, to Egypt, some $1.3 billion, on certification that Egypt is acting to protect the religious freedom of its minorities. The administration, both Secretaries Clinton and Secretary Kerry, refused to do so and waived it. Perhaps not surprisingly, the government of Egypt continues to allow attacks on Coptic Christians with impunity. I've actually chaired 3 hearings on the targeting of Coptic Christians, and I do believe much more needs to be done and robustly done to protect this minority in Egypt. Money does talk. The United States should be using assistance to ensure recipient countries and entities have a plan, ensure that they have a plan that is implemented to protect vulnerable religious minorities. And with that, I look forward to hearing the testimony of our distinguished witness from the administration, but I would like to ask Mr. Schneider if he has any comments, and then go to Randy.